Before cities rose from river clay, before the first temple lifted toward heaven, before writing could preserve what humans knew, our ancestors looked up from African savannas where humanity first walked upright, looked up from caves where they sheltered against the cold, looked up and saw not chaos, but pattern, lights that returned night after night, that moved in predictable paths, that marked the passage of seasons with reliability no earthly phenomenon could match. The sky was humanity's first teacher, and humanity proved an eager student. We cannot know when humans first recognized patterns in the stars, cannot know who first noticed that certain bright lights wandered while others stayed fixed, cannot know when the connection was made between stellar positions and seasonal changes, that when certain stars appeared at dawn, the rains would come, that when others dominated the evening sky, the animals would migrate. The knowledge predates writing by tens of thousands of years. It lives only in what those early observers left behind: stone arrangements, bone markings, cave paintings that may encode celestial observations we are only beginning to understand. Consider the Lascaux caves in France, where Paleolithic artists painted bison and horses with breathtaking skill 17,000 years ago. Among the animal images, researchers have noted patterns of dots that may represent the Pleiades and Hyades star clusters. The bull painted on one low wall may depict not just animal, but constellation, Taurus, positioned in relationship to other markings that could represent nearby stars. The interpretation is disputed, as all interpretations of prehistoric art must be. But the possibility haunts that humans were mapping the sky before they were mapping the earth, that celestial observation is older than we imagined, that our ancestors' sophistication exceeded our assumptions. The Nebra sky disk speaks more clearly. This bronze circle, found in Germany and dated to approximately 1600 BC, depicts sun and moon and a cluster of stars arranged in patterns that suggest astronomical knowledge. The cluster appears to represent the Pleiades, whose disappearance and reappearance marked important dates in ancient agricultural calendars. The disk may have served as portable astronomical calculator, helping its users determine planting and harvest times by tracking celestial positions. The craftsmanship is beautiful: gold inlays against green patinated bronze, celestial bodies rendered with artistic care. The knowledge encoded is practical, astronomical observation applied to agricultural necessity. The disk reminds us that ancient peoples did not distinguish between beautiful and useful, between sacred and practical. The sky was all these things at once. But how was such knowledge transmitted before writing existed? Oral tradition carried it, songs and stories that encoded astronomical information in memorable forms, that passed from elder to youth across countless generations, that maintained accuracy through repetition and ritual importance. The Aboriginal Australians, whose culture stretches back, perhaps, 60,000 years. Preserve astronomical knowledge in songlines and dreaming stories. The Pleiades figure prominently as seven sisters in one telling, their seasonal appearance marking the beginning of winter, their associated stories encoding information about the star's movement and significance. The knowledge survived because it was sacred, because it was sung, because each generation took responsibility for transmitting it unchanged. Consider what this transmission required that each generation value the knowledge enough to preserve it, required that teachers take care in transmission, that students take care in receiving, required that the chain remain unbroken across centuries and millennia, that catastrophe not interrupt, that cultural change not erase what previous generations had valued. The oral traditions that preserved astronomical knowledge were remarkable achievements, less flashy than pyramids, less tangible than written tablets, but no less impressive as demonstrations of human capability. The earliest astronomical observations were likely practical. Tracking seasons mattered for survival, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when animals would migrate, when rivers would flood. The stars provided calendar more reliable than any earthly phenomenon. The sun's position changed gradually across months. The moon's phases cycled every 29 days. The stars' seasonal appearances marked annual rhythms with precision that observation over generations refined. The knowledge was valuable because it worked, because it helped communities survive, because it turned the seemingly chaotic sky into readable map of time. But practical observation became something more, became sacred. The reliability of celestial patterns suggested order underlying apparent chaos, suggested powers greater than human maintaining the cosmos, suggested that understanding the sky meant understanding something fundamental about existence. The stars were not merely useful, they were meaningful. Their patterns were not merely practical, they were profound. The transition from observation to religion, from tracking to worship, happened so early in human history that we cannot separate the threads. When we first looked up, we saw both calendar and cosmos, both guide and God. The constellations emerged from this double vision. Different cultures saw different patterns in the same stars. Bears and hunters, animals and ancestors, gods and heroes projected onto the celestial dome. The patterns were arbitrary in one sense. No physical connection links the stars we group together, but the patterns were profoundly meaningful in another sense. They encoded stories that encoded knowledge, that encoded understanding, accumulated over generations. To know the constellations was to know the stories, was to know the wisdom the stories preserved. We close this chapter beneath an imagined ancient sky, a sky unpolluted by artificial light, where the Milky Way blazed bright enough to cast shadows, where thousands of stars were visible to naked eye, where the celestial dome seemed close enough to touch. Our ancestors stood beneath this sky and saw what we cannot see, From our illuminated cities, they named what they saw in the languages we do not remember. They tracked patterns we are only now recovering. They began the work of understanding that we continue still. The first fires that named the heavens have long since burned out. The namers are dust. Their languages are silence. But the stars they observed still shine, still move in patterns they first noticed, still offer guidance to those who remember how to read them. The knowledge began here, in observations so ancient we cannot date them, in traditions so old they predate writing by tens of thousands of years. The sky was humanity's first teacher. The lessons began before history, and they continue still for those patient enough to learn. Across the wind-swept moors of Britain, through the forested plains of Brittany, on Mediterranean islands where waves crash against ancient cliffs, massive stones stand arranged in patterns that capture celestial events. These are the megaliths, monuments raised by Neolithic peoples who lacked metal tools, lacked wheels, lacked written language, yet possessed knowledge sophisticated enough to align stones with astronomical precision. The monuments have stood for millennia. Their builders are unknown. Their purposes are debated, but their alignments are undeniable, testifying to astronomical understanding that predates the civilizations we usually credit with such knowledge. Stonehenge rises from Salisbury Plain in southern England, its iconic silhouette recognized worldwide. The outer circle of sarsen stones, each weighing approximately 25 tons, stands or leans or has fallen, forming the most famous prehistoric structure in Europe. The inner horseshoe of blue stones, smaller but mysterious because they originated in Wales 200 miles distant, creates a more intimate sacred space. The monument evolved over 1,500 years, from simple circular ditch around 3100 BCE to the stone arrangements completed around 2400 BCE. Multiple generations invested in the site, modified it, elaborated it, clearly considered it important enough to maintain across centuries. The astronomical alignments are precise. At summer solstice, the sun rises directly above the heelstone when viewed from the monument's center. At winter solstice, the sun sets in alignment with the tallest trilithons. These alignments are not accidental. The positioning required careful observation, precise planning, enormous effort in moving and placing massive stones. The builders understood the solar cycle, knew when solstices would occur, chose to mark these moments through architecture that would capture celestial light and direct it along specific paths. Stonehenge was, among other things, an astronomical instrument. But what did the alignments mean to those who created them? The question cannot be answered with certainty. Stonehenge left no written records. Its builders left no explanations. We can measure what they built, but cannot know what they believed, cannot recover the rituals they performed, cannot hear the songs they sang, As solstice light fell along the ancient stones, the monument speaks in language of shadow and light, and we are still learning to translate. Newgrange in Ireland's Boyne Valley predates Stonehenge by centuries. This passage tomb, constructed around 3200 BCE, consists of a circular mound covering a stone passage leading to a cruciform chamber. The entrance features a light box, a carefully constructed aperture positioned so that at winter solstice, sunrise for approximately 17 minutes, sunlight penetrates the passage and illuminates the innermost chamber. For over 5,000 years, this alignment has functioned, has marked the shortest day, has brought light to the heart of darkness at the moment when days begin lengthening again. The precision required to achieve this alignment testifies to sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The builders had to know when winter solstice occurred, had to understand that the sunrise position changes daily and reaches its southernmost point only on that specific day, had to calculate angles and distances to ensure that the light box would admit light along the passage at the correct moment. They possessed knowledge we might expect from civilizations with writing and mathematics. They achieved precision we might expect from cultures with metal tools and engineering traditions. Yet they predated all of this, built with stone tools, transmitted knowledge through oral traditions, created monument that still functions as they intended 5 millennia later. The Karnak stones in Brittany present different mystery. Here, over 3,000 standing stones march in roughly parallel rows, stretching across miles of landscape. The stones vary in height, from knee-high to over 20 feet tall. The alignments run roughly east-west, perhaps marking seasonal positions of rising or setting sun. But the arrangement's purpose remains unknown. Were they processional ways for rituals we cannot imagine? Were they territorial markers claiming landscape for communities long vanished? Were they astronomical observation lines tracking celestial events we have not yet identified? The stones keep their silence. Walking among the Karnak stones is disorienting experience. The sheer number overwhelms, more standing stones than any other megalithic site, arranged with evident intention but inscrutable meaning. The rows seem to march toward something, to direct movement and attention in specific directions. But toward what? The stones were not raised randomly. They were placed with purpose, but the purpose eludes us. The communities that raised them left no records. The traditions that explained them did not survive. The stones remain, testifying to effort and intention, refusing to reveal what that intention was. Malta's temples are older still. Gantia on Gozo, dating to approximately 3600 BCE, is among the oldest freestanding structures in the world. Older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than any monument we associate with ancient civilization. The Maltese temples are not simple stone circles, but elaborate buildings with curved walls and multiple chambers constructed from limestone blocks weighing tons, fitted without mortar, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of stone construction. Astronomical alignments appear here too, temple orientations that may mark equinoxes, architectural features that may track stellar positions. The civilization zone that built Malta's temples left no writing, vanished from history, left only the stones as testimony to their existence. We call them temple builders because we do not know what they called themselves. We assume the structures were religious because we do not know what ceremonies they hosted. We measure the alignments because we cannot recover the beliefs that gave alignments meaning. The temples are beautiful, are sophisticated, are evidence that complex architectural traditions existed long before the cultures we usually credit with such achievements. But they are also silent, stones that speak only through their arrangement, builders who left only what they built. What drove these Neolithic peoples to invest such extraordinary effort in capturing celestial events? The question touches something fundamental about human nature. The alignments were not necessary for survival. Communities could have tracked seasons through simpler means, could have noted solstices without building monuments that required generations to complete. Something beyond practical necessity motivated the work. Something about marking the moment when light fell along precisely calculated path mattered enough to justify enormous investment of labor and time. Perhaps the alignments connected communities to cosmic order, demonstrated that humans could understand and participate in celestial patterns, provided reassurance that the world was comprehensible and that human action could harmonize with cosmic rhythms. Perhaps the monuments were gathering places where scattered communities came together at significant moments where social bonds were renewed, where shared observation of astronomical events created shared identity. Perhaps the alignments were prayers made physical, permanent expressions of devotion to powers that governed the sky, testaments that would persist long after individual devotees had died. We cannot know with certainty. The builders are gone, their beliefs are unrecorded, their intentions survive only in what they built. But what they built endures. Stones that still capture solstice light, chambers that still illuminate at the proper moment, alignments that still function 5,000 years after their creation. The megaliths are testimony to human capability, to astronomical knowledge that predates what we usually consider civilization, to the ancient human drive to understand the cosmos and to mark that understanding in forms that would outlast individual lives. We close standing among standing stones at twilight, feeling the weight of their presence, honoring the mystery they represent. The people who raised these stones are lost to us. Their language is unrecorded. Their beliefs are undocumented. Their stories have been silenced by time, but their work remains. Their alignments still function. Their monuments still capture celestial light, still mark the moments they deemed significant enough to encode in stone. The megaliths speak without words, speak of human need to understand, to mark, to connect with patterns larger than individual existence. The stones that caught the light still catch it. The circles that marked the solstice still mark it. The mystery remains, inviting contemplation, rewarding patience, reminding us that much of human achievement predates what we usually call history, that wisdom is older than writing, that the stars were mapped in stone before they were mapped in words. In the land between two rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow toward the Persian Gulf, where some of humanity's first cities rose from fertile alluvial soil, astronomical observation became systematic science. The Sumerians and their Babylonian successors did not merely watch the sky, they recorded what they saw, tracked patterns over centuries, developed mathematics to predict celestial events, created knowledge that would shape how we still measure time. The 60-minute hour, the 60-second minute, the degrees and minutes and seconds we use for angles all derive from Babylonian calculations, from observations made in Mesopotamian darkness. 4,000 years ago, the rivers taught time, and their lessons flow through our clocks still. The transition from casual observation to systematic astronomy happened here, in scribal schools, where young men learned to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, in temples where priests tracked celestial omens, in royal courts where astronomical predictions informed political decisions. The clay tablets that archaeologists have recovered, thousands of them, preserved because fire hardened the clay rather than destroying it, reveal astronomical knowledge of remarkable sophistication. The Babylonians tracked the movements of sun, moon, and 5 visible planets with precision that modern calculations confirm. They predicted eclipses with accuracy that required understanding of cycles spanning centuries. They developed mathematical techniques that would not be surpassed until the Greeks. The Emul Apin tablets, dating from around 1000 BC but preserving knowledge accumulated over centuries earlier, provide comprehensive astronomical compendium. They list stars and constellations, track helical risings, when stars first become visible at dawn after period of invisibility, record intercalary months added to keep lunar calendar aligned with solar year. The tablets reveal that Babylonians divided the sky into 3 broad regions, the paths of Anu, Enlil, and Ea, and tracked which constellations appeared in each region at different times of year. They understood that the sun moved through these regions annually, that certain stars were visible only in certain seasons, that the celestial calendar repeated with reliable precision. The zodiac emerged from Babylonian observation. By dividing the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the sky, into 12 equal sections, each associated with a constellation, they created framework that would persist for millennia. The 12 signs still appear in horoscopes, still structure astrological thinking, still derive from Babylonian decisions about how to organize celestial observation. That the signs no longer align with the constellations they were named for due to precession of the equinoxes, matters less than the persistence of the framework itself. When we speak of Aries or Taurus, Leo or Scorpio, we use categories Babylonian astronomers established, concepts that have traveled through Greek and Arabic and European thought to reach us essentially unchanged. Venus received particular attention. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating from the 17th century BC, records observations of Venus's appearances and disappearances over 21 years. Venus, as brightest object in the sky besides sun and moon, was obvious candidate for careful tracking. Its complex pattern, appearing as evening star for months, vanishing, reappearing as morning star, vanishing again, required long-term observation to understand. The Babylonians tracked these phases, noted when Venus appeared and disappeared, developed predictions that proved accurate. Their observations, recorded on clay tablets, match modern calculations with impressive precision. But Babylonian astronomy was not disinterested science, was deeply intertwined with astrology, with belief that celestial events presaged earthly ones, that understanding the sky meant understanding what the gods intended. The astronomical tablets often include ominous interpretations. If certain celestial configuration appeared, certain earthly events would follow. The precision of observation served predictive purposes that we might consider superstitious, yet the observations themselves were accurate, the mathematics sophisticated, the accumulated knowledge genuine regardless of the purposes it served. The mathematics developed to handle astronomical calculation shaped all subsequent mathematics. The Babylonians used base 60 number system, which is why we have 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. The choice seems arbitrary until one realizes that 60 is remarkably divisible, can be divided evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making fractional calculations much simpler than with base 10. The mathematical convenience enabled precise astronomical calculations, and the system proved so useful that it persists today. Every time we read a clock, we use Babylonian mathematics. Every time we measure an angle, we employ Babylonian categories. The lunar calendar created its own challenges. 12 lunar months total, approximately 354 days, 11 days short of the solar year. Without correction, the months would drift through the seasons, eventually having harvest festivals in planting time and planting festivals in harvest. The Babylonians developed intercalation, adding extra months at regular intervals to keep lunar calendar aligned with solar year. By the 5th century BCE, they had developed the 19-year Metonic cycle, adding 7 extra months over 19 years to maintain alignment. The precision required tracking patterns over decades and centuries, required institutional commitment to continuous observation, required transmission of knowledge across generations of astronomers. The knowledge passed from Babylon to the wider world. Greeks learned from Babylonian astronomers, adopted and adapted their observations, combined them with Greek philosophical traditions to create Hellenistic astronomy. The zodiac, the mathematical techniques, the observational records, all traveled westward, influencing how subsequent civilizations understood the sky. When the Library of Alexandria gathered knowledge from across the ancient world, Babylonian astronomy was among the treasures preserved, translated, elaborated, but much was also lost. Babylon fell to Persians, to Greeks, to Parthians, eventually declined into ruin. The scribal schools closed. The continuous tradition of observation ended. The clay tablets were buried and forgotten until 19th century archaeologists began recovering them. The knowledge that had accumulated over millennia was interrupted, had to be partially reconstructed from texts that happened to survive, from tablets that happened to be preserved. What we know of Babylonian astronomy is fraction of what existed. The tablets that survived, the texts that were copied, the knowledge that passed into Greek and Arabic and European traditions. How much more was lost? How much was never recorded, was transmitted orally and died with its keepers, was recorded but on tablets that crumbled or burned or remain undiscovered? The silence is as significant as the survival. We close contemplating the rivers that taught time. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though dams now regulate their ancient floods. The cities where astronomers observed Babylon, Uruk, Nippur are ruins, archaeological sites, rather than living communities. The scribal traditions that preserved astronomical knowledge ended more than 2,000 years ago, but the knowledge persists in our 60-minute hours, in our zodiacal signs, in the mathematical techniques that Babylonian ingenuity developed. The rivers taught time, and we are still their students, still measuring the world in terms they established, still tracking celestial patterns they first noticed, still inheriting wisdom they accumulated over centuries of patient observation in Mesopotamian darkness. The clay tablets wait in museums, precious and fragile, testimony to knowledge that outlasted the civilization that created it. The stars the Babylonians tracked still shine. The cycles they observed still repeat. The time they learned to measure still flows, still carries their wisdom forward, still connects us to astronomers who watched the sky 4 millennia ago and saw patterns we still recognize. The rivers that taught time, the lessons that endure, the inheritance we carry without always knowing its source. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns to true north within zero point zero 0.05 degrees, precision that modern builders with GPS and lasers would find challenging, achieved by ancient Egyptians with tools we can barely imagine. The alignment is not accidental. It required sophisticated astronomical observation, careful planning, enormous effort to ensure that this massive structure, 2.3 million stone blocks, 481 feet tall, 13 acres at its base, pointed precisely toward the celestial pole. The pyramid was technology and theology combined, architectural achievement serving spiritual purpose, monument to Pharaoh's eternal life, oriented toward stars that never set. Egyptian astronomy served the dead. The elaborate burial practices, the mummification rituals, the books of the dead inscribed on papyrus and painted on tomb walls, all existed to ensure successful passage to the afterlife, to guide the deceased through dangers of the underworld, to secure eternal existence among the imperishable stars. The sky was not merely object of study, it was destination. The circumpolar stars, those near enough to the celestial pole that they never dipped below the horizon, were called imperishable ones, souls of the blessed dead who had achieved immortality. The Pharaoh hoped to join them, to sail among the stars in the solar bark, to live forever in the sky he had observed in life. The pyramid shafts point toward specific stellar positions. From the king's chamber, one shaft aligns toward where Orion's belt would have appeared around 2500 BCE. From the queen's chamber, another shaft aligns toward where Sirius would have risen. These alignments have generated controversy. Some scholars question whether they are intentional. Others propose elaborate theories about the shaft's purposes. But the orientations themselves are measurable, are precise, are evidence that the builders considered stellar positions when designing the internal passages. The pyramid was not merely tomb, but cosmic machine oriented toward heavens in ways that reflected Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. The Orion correlation theory goes further, proposes that the three Giza pyramids mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, that the Nile represents the Milky Way, that the entire Giza complex was designed as terrestrial reflection of celestial pattern. The theory is disputed, lacks conclusive evidence, may read more intention into the arrangement than actually existed, but its poetry speaks to something true about Egyptian thought, the conviction that earthly and heavenly realms corresponded, that what happened below reflected what existed above, that architecture could participate in cosmic order by embodying celestial patterns. Sirius held special significance. Its heliacal rising, first appearance at dawn after a period of invisibility, coincided with the Nile flood, the annual inundation that renewed Egypt's fertility. The connection between star and flood seemed too precise to be coincidental. It suggested that celestial events governed earthly ones, that Sirius somehow caused or signaled the life giving waters. The star was associated with Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, wife of Osiris, who ruled the underworld. The mythology encoded astronomical observation. Sirius and Orion appeared together in the sky as Isis and Osiris were joined in myth. The deacons was another astronomical innovation. The Egyptians divided the night into periods marked by rising of specific star groups, 36 decans that served as a celestial clock, each ruling for 10 days before the next deacon's heliacal rising. The system required careful observation of which stars rose just before dawn at different times of year, required tracking patterns over years to establish which stars marked which periods. The deacons eventually influenced the 24-hour day, 12 night hours marked by deacons, 12 day hours created for symmetry, though the hours varied in length with the seasons until standardization much later. Temple alignments reinforced the connection between architecture and astronomy. Temples were oriented toward specific celestial events: sunrise on equinox, rising of particular stars, positions that had religious significance. The temple at Karnak aligns so that sunlight penetrates the innermost sanctuary on winter solstice, illuminating the sacred space at the moment of the sun's rebirth. The Abu Simbel temples align so that sunlight illuminates inner statues on specific dates, perhaps Ramesses' birthday and coronation anniversary. The precision varied, the purposes differed, but the principle remained constant. Architecture should participate in celestial order, should mark significant astronomical moments, should connect earthly structures to heavenly patterns. The astronomical ceilings in tombs and temples depicted the night sky. Stars and constellations painted on curved surfaces, creating the illusion of lying beneath the heavens. The tomb of Senenmut, architect under Hatshepsut, features one of the earliest astronomical ceilings, showing constellations and decans and planetary positions. The ceiling in the Hathor temple at Dendera, though from much later period, preserves Egyptian astronomical tradition in elaborate detail: zodiacal figures, deacons, celestial boats carrying gods through heavenly waters. These ceilings were not merely decorative, they were functional, depicting the sky so that the deceased could navigate it, showing the paths that souls would travel toward imperishable stars. But Egyptian astronomy also served practical purposes. Surveying the land after annual floods required understanding of geometry and measurement that astronomical observation helped develop. Determining the correct date for festivals and agricultural activities required calendar that tracked both lunar months and solar year. The practical and the sacred intertwined. The knowledge that helped plant crops also helped bury pharaohs. The observations that predicted floods also predicted afterlife journeys. The knowledge passed to the Greeks when Alexander conquered Egypt, when the Ptolemaic dynasty established Alexandria as intellectual capital. Egyptian astronomical traditions merged with Greek philosophical approaches, creating the synthesis that would characterize Hellenistic astronomy. The zodiac, though Babylonian in origin, was elaborated in Egypt. The astrology that modern horoscopes derive from took shape in the fusion of Egyptian and Greek thought. The library at Alexandria gathered Egyptian astronomical texts alongside Greek and Babylonian ones, created repository where different traditions could be compared and combined. Much was lost when Egypt's indigenous culture declined, when hieroglyphs ceased being read, when the connection to ancient knowledge was broken. The astronomical wisdom encoded in temple alignments and tomb paintings was forgotten had to be recovered through archaeology rather than through continuous transmission. When Napoleon's scholars arrived in Egypt in 1798, they found monuments they could not read, alignments they could not explain, astronomical knowledge they did not recognize. The recovery of Egyptian astronomy has been gradual, is still incomplete, is limited by what survives and what scholars can decode. We close beneath the desert, sky-side the Sphinx, that weathered guardian whose astronomical significance remains debated. Some have proposed that the Sphinx aligns toward the rising sun on equinox, that it represents Leo, and was built when Leo rose at dawn on spring equinox. Others dispute such theories, find them based on insufficient evidence. The Sphinx keeps its silence, gazes eastward toward sunrise as it has for 4,500 years, watches stars wheel overhead without revealing what its builders intended, what its orientation meant, what astronomical knowledge its creation required. The pyramids point toward forever, toward stars that have moved since the shafts were aligned, toward constellation positions that have shifted through millennia of precession, but the intention endures to connect earthly monument to heavenly pattern, to orient the dead toward their celestial destination, to build structures that participated in cosmic order. The pyramids remain, weathered but standing, pointing still toward stars the builders tracked, toward heavens they hoped to inhabit, toward forever that they tried to capture in stone. Across the vast Pacific, where ocean stretches unbroken for thousands of miles, where islands are specks in infinite blue, Polynesian navigators accomplished what seems impossible. They sailed from Tahiti to Hawaii, over 2,000 miles of open ocean. They reached Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. They colonized New Zealand, last major landmass to be settled by humans. They did this without compass or sextant, without chart or chronometer, using only the stars, the swells, the flight of birds, and knowledge transmitted through generations of oral tradition. They needed no instruments because they carried the instruments within themselves, maps of the sky memorized perfectly, understanding of ocean patterns learned through years of training, cognitive capabilities that astonish modern scholars. The star compass was fundamental. Polynesian navigators memorized where stars rose and set at different points on the horizon, not approximately, but precisely, creating mental framework that divided the horizon into 32 or more positions. Each position was marked by a star that rose or set there, creating celestial compass that could orient the navigator regardless of conditions. When one guiding star rose too high to serve for navigation, another was taking its place at the horizon. The system required memorizing not just individual star positions, but the sequences that would carry the navigator through an entire night of sailing, the seasonal variations that changed which stars were visible, the entire complex pattern of the night sky. The knowledge was sacred, was transmitted through rigorous training that began in childhood and continued for decades. The navigators, called wayfinders or Pelu in some Polynesian languages, were specialists who dedicated their lives to mastering the skills. They learned star paths that connected islands, memorized which stars would guide them from one destination to another. They learned to read the swells, the deep ocean waves created by distant winds and reflected by distant islands, patterns that could indicate land hundreds of miles away to those trained to perceive them. They learned to watch for signs of land, the flight of birds returning to roost at evening, the clouds that form over islands, the change in water color that indicates shallows. The navigation was not passive, but active. The wayfinder sat in the stern, watching stars when they were visible, feeling the canoe's motion over the swells when they were not. The method used what scholars call dead reckoning, maintaining awareness of position through constant attention to direction and speed, continuously updating the mental map of where the canoe was in relation to where it had been and where it was going. The wayfinder did not sleep during passages, could not, because the navigation required continuous attention. The skill was cognitive, was embodied, was mode of consciousness that modern people find difficult to comprehend. The double-hulled canoes themselves were technological achievements built from carefully shaped timber lashed together with braided fiber. They could carry dozens of people along with supplies for weeks at sea. The sails were woven from pandanus leaves, could be adjusted to sail in multiple directions relative to the wind. The design allowed both stability and speed, could handle the open ocean swells that would have swamped other vessels. The canoes represented accumulated knowledge of generations of builders, designs refined through centuries of trial and error. The colonization of the Pacific was not accidental, but systematic. The Polynesians expanded deliberately, explored systematically, established colonies that maintained connection with homelands through intentional voyaging. The settlement of Hawaii around 800 to 1200 CE required sailing into the wind for much of the journey, a technical achievement that demanded not just navigation skill, but sailing capability beyond what many scholars once assumed possible. The arrival at Easter Island, the most remote inhabited place on Earth, demonstrated that Polynesian navigation could find targets extraordinarily difficult to locate. The settlement of New Zealand, though relatively recent, required crossing some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific, but the knowledge was nearly lost. When Europeans arrived with their instruments and charts, traditional navigation was dismissed as primitive, was gradually abandoned, was replaced by technologies that seemed superior. Colonial education systems taught Western knowledge rather than traditional skills. Younger generations grew up without learning the star paths their ancestors had memorized. By mid-20th century, the wayfinding traditions survived only among scattered elders, some of whom had never made traditional voyages themselves, but had learned the knowledge from those who had. The revival began in the 1960s, led by the Polynesian Voyaging Society in Hawaii. They built Hokuli'a, a double-hulled voyaging canoe, and committed to sailing it using traditional navigation. The problem was finding someone who still knew how. Eventually, they located Mau Piai Lug, a navigator from the Micronesian island of Satawal, where traditional navigation had survived more intact. Mao agreed to teach, to share knowledge that his own culture considered sacred, because he believed the knowledge was more important than any one tradition's claim to own it. The voyage of Hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 demonstrated that traditional navigation worked, that ancestors had possessed knowledge sufficient for oceanic voyaging, that the traditions dismissed as legend were actually sophisticated systems preserved through oral transmission. Subsequent voyages have taken Hokulea around the world, demonstrating that traditional navigation can function across oceans, that the knowledge preserved by Hawaiian and other Polynesian traditions was genuine, that what was nearly lost has been recovered, but the recovery is partial. Mau Piai Lug died in 2010. The navigators he trained continue teaching others, but each transmission changes the knowledge slightly. The star paths memorized by ancient navigators may not be precisely identical to those now being taught. The embodied understanding that came from making voyages from childhood cannot be replicated through shortened training programs. The knowledge survives, but perhaps not in exactly the form it once took, perhaps changed in ways that cannot be measured. We close on a voyaging canoe at night, moving across dark ocean under star-filled sky. The navigator sits in the stern, watching Hokupa'a, Polaris, barely visible above the northern horizon, watching the Southern Cross wheel through the southern sky, feeling the canoe move over swells that indicate distant land. No instruments, but human perception. No charts, but memorized patterns. No technology, but knowledge accumulated over centuries, transmitted through generations, nearly lost and partially recovered. The stars that guided ancient Polynesians still shine. The knowledge that enabled their voyages survives, changed but continuous, testimony to human capability that exceeds what we usually imagine possible. The navigators who needed no instruments, who carried the sky within themselves, who crossed impossible distances using only what they had learned. Their legacy lives in revived traditions, in voyaging canoes that sail still, in the determination to preserve knowledge that nearly vanished. The stars remain, the ocean remains, and those who remember how to read them continue sailing, continue teaching, continue honoring ancestors who accomplished what seems impossible by possessing knowledge we are only beginning to appreciate. Before Galileo turned his telescope toward the heavens and saw what no human had seen before, before lenses magnified the distant and revealed the previously invisible, astronomers studied the sky with naked eyes and remarkable instruments at Alexandria, at Rhodes, at observatories across the ancient world. Greek astronomers measured stellar positions, calculated planetary orbits, developed theories about the structure of the cosmos, all without technology that would seem necessary for such work. They achieved precision that required centuries of subsequent development to surpass. They proposed ideas so advanced that they were forgotten and had to be rediscovered more than a millennium later. The observatory that stood before telescopes was limited in ways we might expect but accomplished far more than we usually assume. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century BC, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the celestial pole to trace a circle through the stars over approximately 26,000 years. He discovered this by comparing his observations to records made by Babylonian astronomers centuries earlier, noting that star positions had shifted slightly relative to the equinoxes. The discovery required both precise observation and access to historical data, demonstrated the value of accumulated astronomical records, revealed a celestial cycle so slow that only long term record keeping could detect it. Hipparchus also created star catalog, listing the positions and magnitudes of hundreds of stars, developed trigonometric techniques for astronomical calculations, estimated the moon's distance with reasonable accuracy. His work represented astronomical achievement not surpassed for centuries. Aristarchus of Samos, a century earlier, proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, heliocentric model that would not gain acceptance until Copernicus revived it 18 centuries later. Aristarchus reasoned that the Sun was much larger than the Earth. He underestimated how much larger, but got the direction right, and that it was more sensible for smaller body to orbit larger. His model was rejected in antiquity, was nearly forgotten, survived only through references in other texts. The geocentric model of Ptolemy, Earth at center, everything else orbiting, became standard, remained dominant until the Copernican revolution. Aristarchus's insight, correct in its essence, was lost for most of human history. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that ancient technology was more sophisticated than usually assumed. This corroded bronze device, recovered from a shipwreck in 1901, puzzled scholars for decades until X ray imaging revealed its internal structure, a complex system of gears that could calculate positions of sun and moon, predict eclipses, possibly track planetary positions. Nothing comparable survived from antiquity. Nothing comparable was built for another 1,000 years. The mechanism suggests that Greek astronomical technology included capabilities we had not suspected, that knowledge existed which did not survive the fall of ancient civilization, that the gap between ancient and modern achievement is smaller than it appears. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference around 240 BCE using geometry and observation. He knew that on summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in Siene, modern Aswan. A well there cast no shadow at noon. In Alexandria, the sun at the same moment cast a shadow indicating it was about 2 degrees from vertical. Knowing the distance between the cities, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, within about 2% of the actual value by some estimates, though the exact figures he used are disputed. The calculation demonstrated that astronomical observation combined with mathematical reasoning could reveal fundamental facts about the Earth, facts that could not be directly perceived but could be deduced from careful measurement. The instruments these astronomers used were ingenious but limited. The astrolabe, possibly invented by Hipparchus, modeled the heavens in portable brass, could determine time and direction, could calculate stellar positions. The armillary sphere represented celestial coordinates in 3 dimensions, allowed astronomers to visualize and measure celestial positions. The quadrant and sextant measured angles with precision that depended on craftsmanship but could achieve accuracy of a few minutes of arc. These instruments were sufficient for the observations that ancient astronomers made, but they could not reveal what telescopes would later show: the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the countless stars invisible to naked eyes. The Ptolemaic system represented ancient astronomy's crowning achievement and its fundamental error. Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, synthesized centuries of observation into a comprehensive model of the cosmos. His Almagest described planetary motions using epicycles, circles upon circles that could account for observed planetary positions with considerable accuracy. The system was geocentric, placed Earth at center, required increasingly complex arrangements of circles to match observation, but it worked. Could predict planetary positions with sufficient accuracy for practical purposes, could explain what was observed, even if the explanation was fundamentally wrong. The Ptolemaic system dominated astronomy for 14 centuries, was transmitted through Arabic translations to medieval Europe, was accepted by the Church as consistent with theological understanding. The error was understandable. Geocentrism matched common sense perception that the Earth was stationary and everything else moved. The observations that would eventually disprove geocentrism, stellar parallax, phases of Venus, Jupiter's moons, required telescopes to detect. With naked eye observation, the geocentric model worked well enough to seem true. Knowledge passed from Alexandria through various transmissions. When the Roman Empire declined and Western learning contracted, Arabic scholars preserved Greek astronomical texts, translated them, refined them, advanced them. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became center of astronomical learning. Islamic observatories developed techniques and instruments that surpassed their Greek predecessors. When Europeans eventually recovered Greek astronomy, it came through Arabic translations, bore the marks of Islamic elaboration, carried forward by scholars who wrote in Arabic about works originally written in Greek. Much was lost in the various transmissions. Texts were copied selectively. What seemed important was preserved, while what seemed peripheral was neglected. Translations introduced errors. Arabic scholars translated Greek that was already translated from Egyptian and Babylonian sources. The Antikythera mechanism suggests that technological knowledge existed which was not preserved in texts. Knowledge of gears and precision manufacturing that apparently did not survive. The gap between what ancient astronomers knew and what we have recovered from ancient sources is unknowable, but certainly significant. We close contemplating the observatory that stood before telescopes, the achievements made possible through patient observation, sophisticated mathematics, and ingenious instruments. The ancient astronomers measured what they could see with accuracy that still impresses. They developed theories that were wrong but productive, that organized observations into systems that could be tested and refined. They created knowledge that survived the fall of civilizations, that passed through multiple translations, that eventually formed the foundation for the scientific revolution. What they achieved without telescopes reminds us that human capability is not limited by technology, that careful observation and rigorous reasoning can accomplish more than we might expect, that the gap between ancient and modern is narrower than we usually assume. When Rome fell and Western Europe dimmed into what later ages would call dark ages, when libraries burned and learning contracted, when the knowledge accumulated over millennia seemed in danger of vanishing entirely, Islamic civilization gathered what was scattered, preserved what might have been lost, and advanced what had been received. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 8th century CE, became center of translation and scholarship, gathering Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, rendering them into Arabic, making knowledge accessible across the vast Islamic world. The light that might have been extinguished was preserved, and more than preserved, was elaborated, refined, advanced. The translation movement was deliberate policy supported by caliphs who understood that knowledge was power. Scholars were paid handsomely to translate Greek texts, by some accounts, receiving the weight of their translations in gold. The works of Aristotle and Plato, Ptolemy and Galen, Euclid and Archimedes, all were translated into Arabic, often through intermediate translations from Greek to Syriac to Arabic. The translations were not passive preservation, but active engagement. Translators added commentaries, corrected errors they detected, raised questions that the original authors had not addressed. Astronomical knowledge received particular attention. Ptolemy's Almagest, that comprehensive but flawed synthesis of ancient astronomy, was translated multiple times, was studied intensively, was refined through continued observation. Islamic astronomers established observatories superior to anything in the ancient world. Marageh in Persia, Samarkand in Central Asia, where they made observations of unprecedented precision. They compiled star catalogs, refined planetary tables, developed mathematical techniques that would later influence European astronomy. Al-Sufi's Book of Fixed Stars, completed in 964 CE, built on Ptolemy's star catalog while adding Arabic star names and improved positions. Many stars still bear their Arabic names: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Deneb, testimony to Islamic astronomy's lasting influence. The instruments developed by Islamic astronomers advanced beyond Greek predecessors. The astrolabe, perhaps Greek in origin, was elaborated into instrument of remarkable sophistication, beautiful objects of brass and silver, capable of solving multiple astronomical and mathematical problems. Islamic craftsmen developed the quadrant and sextant into precision instruments, created observatory equipment of unprecedented accuracy, the mechanical innovations that would later enable European scientific instruments had their origins in Islamic technology transmitted through trade and cultural contact. Mathematical advances enabled better astronomical calculation. Algebra, the name itself derives from Arabic, was developed by Al-Khwarizmi and others, providing tools for solving problems that Greek geometry could not easily handle. Trigonometry was refined, particularly spherical trigonometry needed for astronomical calculations involving celestial coordinates. The numerical system using place value and zero transmitted from India made calculation far easier than with Greek or Roman numerals. These mathematical advances were applied to astronomical problems, enabling calculations of precision that earlier methods could not achieve. The relationship between astronomy and religion was complex. Islamic religious practice required knowing the direction of Mecca from any location for prayer, required determining times of prayer based on solar position, required establishing the beginning of lunar months by naked eye sighting of the crescent moon. These practical religious requirements motivated astronomical observation, created demand for astronomical knowledge throughout the Islamic world. But the relationship went deeper. Understanding the heavens was seen as way of understanding God's creation, as worship through intellectual engagement with the cosmos. The observatories were not secular institutions, but were grounded in religious conviction that knowledge of the heavens was sacred duty. The transmission to Europe happened through multiple channels. Spain, under Islamic rule for centuries, became point of contact where Arabic texts reached European scholars. The great libraries of Cordoba contained texts unknown in Christian Europe. Scholars traveled to Spain to learn Arabic and translate texts into Latin. Sicily, another point of contact, facilitated similar exchanges. The Crusades, despite their violence, also created opportunities for cultural exchange, brought European scholars into contact with Islamic learning. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a systematic translation movement was rendering Arabic texts, including the Arabic translations of Greek texts, into Latin, making knowledge available that Europe had lost or never possessed. The influence on European astronomy was profound. Copernicus's heliocentric model drew on work by Islamic astronomers who had questioned Ptolemaic assumptions. The mathematical techniques Copernicus employed had been developed by Islamic mathematicians. The astronomical tables that European astronomers used were often based on observations made at Islamic observatories. The scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of the cosmos, built on foundations that Islamic scholars had preserved and elaborated. But the transmission was incomplete. Not everything translated into Arabic was later translated into Latin. Selections were made that shaped what Europe received. The institutional structures of Islamic learning, the madrasas, the observatories, the patronage networks, were not transmitted along with the texts. Europe had to develop its own institutions to support sustained astronomical work. The decline of Islamic science, debated in its causes but undeniable in its occurrence, meant that the living tradition of research and observation weakened, leaving texts without the interpretive community that had created them. We close contemplating the houses of wisdom that preserved the light, the scholars who translated and transmitted, who copied manuscripts and taught students, who maintained the chain of knowledge across centuries and civilizations. The transmission was fragile, depended on political support that could be withdrawn, on scribes who could die without training successors, on libraries that could burn. Much was lost despite the preservation efforts. More survived than might have. The light that ancient peoples kindled, that seemed in danger of being extinguished, was preserved through the patient work of scholars who valued knowledge as sacred trust, who transmitted what they received while adding their own contributions, who created the conditions that made later developments possible. The House of Wisdom fell to the Mongols in 1258. The libraries were destroyed, the scholars killed or scattered, the continuous tradition interrupted. But by then, much had been transmitted to other Islamic centers, to Europe, to subsequent generations who would continue the work. The preservation was imperfect, but was sufficient. The knowledge survived, changed by translation, filtered by selection, but surviving nonetheless. The houses of wisdom that preserved the light, the scholars who carried knowledge through darkness, the inheritance we received because they deemed it worth preserving. In the jungles of Central America, where Maya civilization flourished for over 2,000 years, astronomers developed calendar systems of complexity that still inspire wonder. They tracked time across scales ranging from single days to millions of years. They calculated Venus's cycles with precision that modern astronomy confirms. They developed mathematical techniques, including independent invention of zero, that enabled calculations no other pre-Columbian civilization achieved. The calendars were not merely practical, they were sacred, encoded relationships between celestial events and earthly affairs, structured ritual life around astronomical observations, made time itself an object of religious contemplation. The Maya used multiple interlocking calendars. The Tzolkin was a 260-day sacred calendar, combining 20-day names with 13 numbers to create cycle that served religious and divinatory purposes. The Hab was a 365-day solar calendar consisting of 18 months of 20 days plus a 5-day period considered dangerous and unlucky. These two calendars interlocked, creating the calendar round. a 52-year cycle after which any given combination of Tzolk'in and Hob dates would repeat. The calendar round was sufficient for most practical purposes, but the Maya developed another system for counting longer periods. The long count tracked days from a mythological creation date. By most correlations, August event 3114 BCE in our calendar. Using a modified base 20 counting system, the long count could express dates millions of years in the past or future. The system enabled historical records that specified exactly when events occurred, enabled astronomical calculations that compared observation separated by centuries, created framework for understanding time as vast rather than merely cyclical. When a long count cycle completed on December 21st, 2012, what some interpreted as Mayan apocalypse, it simply meant that a particular large unit had completed, like an odometer rolling over, with a new cycle beginning. Venus received extraordinary attention. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 Maya books to survive Spanish destruction, contains elaborate Venus tables tracking the planet's synodic cycle over generations. The Maya calculated this cycle at 584 days, remarkably close to the modern value of 583.92 days. They tracked the planet's first appearance as morning star, its disappearance as it passed behind the sun, its reappearance as evening star, its second disappearance, the precise number of days in each phase. The observations required decades of careful watching, required record keeping across generations, required mathematical sophistication to analyze the patterns detected. The Venus observations were not disinterested science. The first appearance of Venus as morning star was considered ominous, was associated with warfare, was occasion for military campaigns and sacrifice. The Dresden Codex tables include warnings about what would happen at various Venus positions, which direction danger threatened from, what precautions should be taken. The astronomical precision served religious purposes. The accuracy was necessary because the stakes were believed to be high. The intertwining of observation and belief created motivation for careful watching that pure scientific curiosity might not have sustained. Temple architecture encoded astronomical alignments. The governor's palace at Uxmal aligns so that every 8 years, Venus at its southernmost position rises directly over a distant temple. The alignment marks the Venus cycle's completion, demonstrates that Maya architects incorporated astronomical knowledge into building design. The Caracol at Chichen Itza, though not a true observatory, has window alignments that may mark Venus's extreme positions. Throughout Maya territory, buildings were oriented to capture celestial events, to transform architecture into astronomical instrument, but the knowledge was nearly destroyed. The Spanish conquest of the Maya lands brought deliberate destruction of Maya books and knowledge. Bishop Diego de Landa in Iquique ordered the burning of thousands of Maya texts, considering them works of the devil. Of all the books the Maya created across more than 2,000 years of literate civilization, only 4 survived. The astronomical knowledge encoded in those destroyed texts is lost forever. What remains in the four codices and in stone inscriptions is fragment of what existed, glimpse of a system that was vastly more elaborate than we can now reconstruct. The decipherment of Maya writing came slowly. For centuries, scholars assumed the glyphs were purely symbolic, could not be read phonetically. The breakthrough came in the 1950s, 1980s, when scholars demonstrated that Maya writing was fully phonetic system, could be read as it was written, could give voice to inscriptions that had been silent for centuries. The decipherment transformed Maya studies, revealed historical records, identified kings and wars, and rituals previously unknown. The astronomical inscriptions could finally be read, could be correlated with modern astronomical calculations, could confirm the precision of Maya observation. The loss remains devastating. The four surviving codices contain tantalizing hints of astronomical knowledge: Venus tables, eclipse tables, zodiacal calendars, but cannot represent the full range of what Maya astronomers knew. The burned books contained astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, mathematical techniques refined through generations, records that would have revealed how Maya understanding developed and what it ultimately achieved. The burning was not merely destruction of paper, it was erasure of knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate. The Maya people survived. Despite conquest, despite disease that killed perhaps 90% of the population, despite centuries of marginalization, Maya communities persist. Some traditional astronomical knowledge survives. Farmers who still plant by traditional calendars, priests who still track sacred days, communities that maintain connection to ancestral wisdom. The survival is testimony to resilience, to determination to preserve heritage despite overwhelming pressures to abandon it. What survives is fragment, but it is living fragment, maintained by people who trace their ancestry to those who built the temples and tracked the stars. We close contemplating the calendars that counted the sacred, the mathematical sophistication, the observational precision, the integration of astronomy and religion into systems of remarkable complexity, the destruction that nearly erased it all, the survival that ensures some portion continues. The Maya looked at the sky and saw patterns that structured their understanding of time, their religious practice, their relationship to cosmos. The patterns are still there. Venus still completes its cycle in 584 days. The Pleiades still mark seasonal changes. The stars still wheel overhead as they did when Maya, astronomers, watched and recorded. What has changed is who watches, who remembers, who understands what was achieved before the burning, and what fragments were salvaged from the ashes. Before telescopes revealed that the universe was vaster and stranger than anyone imagined, astronomers developed instruments of remarkable precision, brass astrolabes that modeled the heavens, quadrants that measured angles with accuracy approaching modern standards, armillary spheres that demonstrated celestial mechanics. These instruments were beautiful objects as well as functional tools, testimony to craftsmen's skill and astronomers' ingenuity. They enabled observations that advanced understanding significantly within the limits of naked eye astronomy. They prepared the ground for the revolution that would come when lenses turned toward the sky. The astrolabe was perhaps the most elegant of pre telescopic instruments. A flat brass circle, typically 6 to 12 inches in diameter, that modeled the visible heavens through an ingenious combination of rotating plates and fixed scales. The instrument could determine time from stellar positions, could find direction toward any point on the horizon, could calculate when stars would rise and set, could solve numerous astronomical and mathematical problems. Different plates could be inserted for different latitudes, making the astrolabe portable calculator usable throughout the known world. The craftsmanship was often exquisite, instruments decorated with elaborate engraving, scales divided with extraordinary precision, pointers shaped as artistic representations of stars. Islamic craftsmen developed the astrolabe to highest refinement. The instrument may have been Greek in origin, possibly invented by Hipparchus, but Islamic astronomers and craftsmen elaborated it into something far beyond the original astrolabes. From medieval Islamic workshops demonstrate precision machining and mathematical sophistication that required centuries of development. The instruments were prized possessions, were passed down through generations, were treasured as much for beauty as for function. Some surviving examples are museum pieces of extraordinary quality, testimony to craft traditions that achieved excellence without modern tools. The quadrant measured angles, essential for determining stellar positions, for navigation, for any calculation requiring precise measurement of celestial heights. Various forms developed. Simple quadrants with sighting devices and graduated scales. More elaborate versions incorporating astronomical features of the astrolabe. Specialized quadrants designed for particular purposes. The precision achievable depended on size and craftsmanship. Larger instruments could be divided more finely. Expert makers could achieve accuracy within a few minutes of arc. The great observatory quadrants, massive instruments built into permanent installations, achieved precision that would not be substantially improved until telescopes enabled more accurate sighting. The armillary sphere represented the celestial coordinate system in 3 dimensions. Nested rings showed the celestial equator, the ecliptic, the horizon at a given latitude, sometimes the paths of the major planets. The instrument demonstrated how celestial coordinates worked, how stars moved relative to Earth, how the different reference frames related. As teaching tool, it was invaluable. As observational instrument, it could measure positions, though with less precision than quadrants. Large armillary spheres, some as tall as a person, were built at major observatories. Impressive demonstrations of astronomical knowledge made physical. The sextant, or more precisely its predecessor, the cross staff, And then the octant, developed for navigation but served astronomical observation as well. The principle was simple: measure the angle between two objects, typically the sun or a star and the horizon, using a graduated arc and mirrors or sighting devices. The precision achievable increased as the instruments were refined, eventually enabling navigational accuracy sufficient for oceanic voyaging. The transition from astronomer's tool to navigator's necessity marked astronomy's practical value. The knowledge accumulated through observation of the heavens could guide ships across waters they could not see. Tycho Brahe, working in the late 16th century, just before the telescope's invention, pushed naked eye observation to its limits. His observatory on the Danish island of Haven contained enormous instruments, quadrants and armillary spheres, and sextants built on unprecedented scale, calibrated with unprecedented care. His observations of planetary positions achieved accuracy within a few minutes of arc, the best that naked eye astronomy could achieve. These observations, particularly of Mars, provided the data that Johannes Kepler would later use to discover that planetary orbits were ellipses rather than circles. The culmination of pre-telescopic astronomy enabled the revolution that would supersede it. The transition came suddenly. When Galileo pointed a telescope at the sky in 1609, he saw what no human had seen before, saw mountains on the moon, revealing that celestial bodies were not perfect spheres, but had topography like Earth, saw moons orbiting Jupiter, demonstrating that not everything orbited Earth, saw phases of Venus consistent with heliocentrism, but not with the Ptolemaic system, saw countless stars invisible to naked eyes, revealing that the universe was far more populated than anyone had imagined. In months, observations that would have been impossible with the finest traditional instruments transformed humanity's understanding of the cosmos. The telescope did not replace the older instruments immediately. Navigation still required sextants. Astrolabes remained useful for quick calculations. Traditional observation continued alongside telescopic observation, but the scientific cutting edge moved decisively to telescopic astronomy, to observations that required lenses rather than naked eyes, to questions that only magnification could answer. The instruments that had served for millennia became obsolete for advancing knowledge even as they remained useful for practical purposes. We close contemplating the instruments in museum cases, astrolabes green with age, quadrants whose scales are worn smooth, armillary spheres whose rings no longer rotate freely. These were the tools that astronomers used to understand the heavens, the technology that enabled observations still cited in astronomical literature. The craftsmanship is admirable, the precision impressive given the available tools, the beauty undeniable, but they are also relics, testimony to what could be achieved within limits that telescopes would surpass. The instruments that made the invisible visible up to a point until different instruments could show what these could never reveal. The stars that Tycho observed still shine. The calculations that astrolabes enabled still work. The precision that quadrants achieved still impresses. But the instrument's time has passed. They belong to history rather than to practice, to museums rather than to observatories. The instruments that preceded telescopes remind us that human ingenuity can achieve remarkable results with limited technology, that the gap between ancient and modern is narrower than we assume, that the knowledge our ancestors accumulated was genuine despite the tool's limitations. The instruments, the craftsmanship, the observations they enabled, the knowledge they preserved, all testimony to human determination to understand the heavens with whatever means were available. For millennia, before GPS satellites and electronic navigation, sailors trusted their lives to the stars, trusted that Polaris would mark north, that the Southern Cross would indicate south, that the patterns their fathers and grandfathers had learned would guide them across waters they could not see to harbors they could not yet glimpse. Celestial navigation was practical astronomy, knowledge applied to survival, understanding of the sky that meant the difference between reaching home and vanishing into the endless sea. The charts that guided ships home were drawn in light, memorized in minds, translated into courses that led across oceans. The principles were established early. Phoenician sailors venturing beyond the Mediterranean, perhaps 3,000 years ago, used Polaris to maintain course, understood that the star's height above the horizon indicated latitude. Greek sailors knew the constellations, used them to navigate the Aegean and beyond. But systematic celestial navigation developed more slowly, required mathematical techniques and precise instruments that took centuries to mature. The methods that would enable European voyages of exploration built on foundations laid by Polynesian wayfinders, Arab navigators, Chinese admirals, knowledge accumulated across cultures and transmitted through trade and contact. Latitude was relatively straightforward. Measure the height of Polaris above the horizon, or the sun at noon, or stars whose positions were known, and simple calculation gave the north-south position. Tables and instruments made the calculation routine. Sailors who had never studied astronomy could determine their latitude with reasonable accuracy using methods they had learned by rote. The limitation was that latitude alone was insufficient. A ship could know how far north or south it was while remaining uncertain about its east-west position. Longitude was the difficult problem. Unlike latitude, longitude could not be determined by simple observation of celestial positions. The stars looked the same at any longitude along a given line of latitude. Determining longitude required knowing time precisely, specifically, the time at a reference location compared to local time. Since the Earth rotates 360 degrees in 24 hours, each hour of time difference corresponds to 15 degrees of longitude. But keeping accurate time at sea was extraordinarily difficult. The pendulum clocks that worked well on land were useless on rolling ships. The solution was the marine chronometer, a clock accurate enough to maintain reference time throughout a voyage. John Harrison spent decades developing such instruments, finally producing timepieces that could keep time within seconds per day, despite temperature changes and ship's motion. His chronometers enabled accurate longitude determination, transformed navigation from art to science, made it possible to chart the world's coastlines accurately. The charts that resulted, detailed maps showing depths and hazards, coastlines and harbors, enabled navigation that previous generations could not have achieved. But celestial navigation did not disappear. The instruments could fail, chronometers could stop, ships could lose their navigation equipment in storms. The ability to determine position from stars remained essential backup, required knowledge that could not be lost to mechanical failure. Naval academies taught celestial navigation alongside electronic methods. The sextant remained in the navigation room even when GPS provided more convenient position determination. The knowledge was too valuable to abandon entirely. The decline came gradually, then rapidly. Electronic navigation, first radio based systems, then satellite based GPS, provided position determination easier and more accurate than celestial methods. Fewer sailors learned to use sextants. Celestial navigation became specialty skill rather than universal requirement. The stars that had guided ships for millennia became irrelevant to practical navigation, were supplanted by technology that did not require looking at the sky at all. The loss is practical and symbolic. Practically, electronic systems can fail through equipment damage, through deliberate interference, through circumstances that disable the satellites or receivers. When they fail, celestial navigation provides backup that requires only clear sky and functioning instrument. The naval vessels that still train officers in celestial methods acknowledge this reality. The knowledge survives because it might be needed. Symbolically, the loss represents disconnection from the sky that defined human relationship with cosmos for millennia. The stars that guided ancestors across oceans are now invisible to most people, irrelevant to most navigation, forgotten by most sailors. The knowledge that connected humans to heavens through practical necessity is fading, is preserved only by those who deliberately choose to maintain it. We close on a ship at night, navigator taking star sights with sextant. The chronometer ticks. The tables wait on the chart table. The positions will be plotted and compared with GPS for verification. The practice is unusual now, is training exercise rather than necessity, is preservation of knowledge that might otherwise disappear. But the stars are the same stars that Phoenician sailors watched, that Polynesian navigators memorized, that guided countless voyages to safe harbor. The connection to that history, to those countless navigators who trusted the stars with their lives, survives in the practice of celestial navigation, fragile, diminishing, but not yet extinguished. The charts that guided ships home, the knowledge that enabled oceanic voyaging, the stars that sailors trusted with their lives, all testimony to astronomy's practical value to knowledge that mattered because survival depended on it. The GPS coordinates flash on the screen, precise to meters, but the stars still shine, still offer guidance to those who remember how to read them, still connect those who look up to all the navigators who looked up before them, seeking the patterns that would lead them home. For all of human history, until recent centuries, the night sky blazed with light, the Milky Way arched overhead, bright enough to cast shadows, a river of light that every human could see. Thousands of stars were visible to naked eyes, not dozens as city dwellers now see, but thousands, each culture naming different patterns, finding different stories in the same points of light. The celestial dome was immediate presence in every human's experience, was inescapable, was the backdrop against which human life unfolded. No one had to seek the stars. They were simply there, undeniable, available to all who looked up. The change came gradually. Cities grew, lamps multiplied. The darkness that humans had known since the beginning began to lift. At first, the change was local. Artificial light brightened streets and buildings, but left the sky overhead largely unchanged. But as cities expanded and lighting intensified, the cumulative effect became visible. Sky glow, light scattered by atmosphere back toward the ground, began to wash out fainter stars, began to dim the Milky Way, began to make the celestial dome seem sparse where it had been rich. The acceleration came in the 20th century. Electric lighting replaced gas and candles, was brighter, was cheaper, could be deployed without limit. Suburbs spread, each house with its outdoor lights, each street with its lamps. Commercial lighting blazed through the night. Advertising signs, parking lot lights, security illumination. The darkness retreated, was pushed beyond suburbs into ever more remote areas. By century's end, most of humanity lived under skies from which all but the brightest stars had been erased. The statistics are stark. A third of humanity cannot see the Milky Way. In the most light polluted areas, fewer than 20 stars are visible, compared to thousands visible from truly dark locations. Children in cities have never seen what every human before the modern era saw nightly: the full glory of the stellar heavens, the unmistakable presence of the cosmos, the sky that inspired religions and guided navigators and connected humans to something larger than themselves. The loss is practical. Animals whose behavior depends on darkness, migrating birds navigating by stars, sea turtles following moonlight to the ocean, insects drawn fatally to artificial lights, suffer from the disruption. Human health may be affected. Disrupted circadian rhythms, reduced melatonin production, impacts whose full extent is still being studied. The energy wasted lighting the sky rather than the ground represents inefficiency that better designed lighting could address. The practical arguments for reducing light pollution are substantial even before considering aesthetic or spiritual dimensions. But the deeper loss is harder to quantify. The connection to cosmos, that the night sky provided, the immediate, visceral awareness of being on a planet in a universe of incomprehensible scale, is severed when the sky is invisible. The sense of smallness that the stars provoke, the humility that comes from confronting the infinite, the wonder that the heavens inspire, all diminish when the heavens cannot be seen. The sky that shaped human consciousness for hundreds of thousands of years, that inspired religions and philosophies, that provided orientation in both navigational and existential senses. That sky is disappearing from human experience. The preservation efforts are growing. Dark sky preserves protect areas where the night sky remains visible, parks and reserves where lighting is controlled, where visitors can experience what all humans once experienced nightly. Organizations advocate for better lighting design, fixtures that direct light downward rather than upward, that illuminate what needs illuminating without brightening the sky. Cities have begun adopting dark sky policies, recognizing that the stars are a resource worth protecting, that the cost of losing them exceeds the convenience of unrestricted lighting. But the trends continue in the other direction. Global light pollution increases approximately 2% per year, the dark areas shrinking, the bright areas expanding, the sky becoming steadily less visible. LED lighting, though more efficient, is often deployed in ways that increase rather than decrease sky glow. The will to reduce light pollution is limited. The economic interests favoring more lighting are powerful. The loss of the night sky is accepted as necessary price of modern life. We close with an invitation to seek the darkness, to find places where the stars remain visible, to experience what ancestors experienced when they looked up and saw the heavens in full glory. The Milky Way still exists. It has not diminished. The thousands of stars are still there. They have not faded. What has changed is whether we can see them, whether we choose to create conditions where seeing them is possible. The sky that guided civilizations, that inspired religions, that connected humans to cosmos for hundreds of thousands of years. That sky waits beyond the artificial brightness, patient and eternal for those who seek it. The light pollution that erased the sky, the loss that most people do not notice because they never knew what was lost, the stars that still shine above the brightness, invisible but present, waiting, the darkness that preceded human existence and will follow it, the choice we face about whether to preserve access to the heavens or to accept their erasure as inevitable, the light, the darkness, the stars that endure regardless of whether we can see them. The journey ends not with conclusion, but with pause, with acknowledgement that the story continues, that knowledge is still being lost and recovered, that each generation must choose what to preserve. We have traced astronomical wisdom from its beginnings in prehistoric observation, through its development in Mesopotamian scribal schools and Egyptian temples, through its preservation in Islamic houses of wisdom, and its near destruction in American book burnings. We have watched it guide ships across oceans and vanish from urban skies. The story is not over. We live within it, participants rather than observers, inheritors of accumulated wisdom and potential contributors to its continuation. The losses are real. The Babylonian text that burned when libraries were destroyed, the Maya books that Spanish priests consigned to flames, the oral traditions that ended when the last keeper died without transmitting what they knew, the instruments that survive in museums but whose use is no longer understood, the star names that were forgotten when languages died, the observations that were made but not recorded, the calculations that were performed but not preserved, the knowledge that existed in minds that did not pass it on. The losses are immeasurable because we cannot know what we have lost. We can only glimpse the edges of absence, can only estimate from what survives how much has vanished. But survival is real too. The star names that carry Arabic etymology: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, testimony to transmission through Islamic scholarship. The Babylonian time divisions we use daily: 60 minutes, 60 seconds, inheritance from scribes who tracked celestial cycles 4 millennia ago. The Polynesian navigation techniques deliberately revived. The Maya glyphs finally speaking after centuries of silence. The astronomical alignments of megaliths still functioning as builders intended. Knowledge survives through continuous effort, through copying and translation and teaching, through determination that what was learned should not be forgotten. The transmission is fragile, depends on political support that can be withdrawn, on institutions that can collapse, on individuals who must choose to maintain what they received. The House of Wisdom fell to the Mongols. The Library of Alexandria burned. The scribal schools of Mesopotamia closed when the cities that supported them declined. What seems permanent proves vulnerable. What seems secure reveals its dependence on conditions that can change. The survival of astronomical knowledge to the present was not inevitable. It happened because specific people made specific choices to preserve what they valued. The responsibility passes to us, to those who receive knowledge accumulated over millennia, who have access to understanding that countless predecessors worked to develop, who must choose whether to preserve and transmit or to allow erosion and loss. The choice is not abstract. It is made in decisions about education and funding, about preservation and access, about what we value enough to maintain. The knowledge that reached us was preserved through conscious effort. Its continuation to future generations requires similar commitment. The stars still shine. That must be said clearly, must be remembered through all discussion of loss and preservation. The celestial patterns that ancient peoples tracked are the same patterns we can observe, shifted slightly by precession, but fundamentally unchanged. The knowledge that was accumulated over millennia was knowledge about something real, something that persists regardless of whether we remember how to read it. The stars do not care whether we know their names. whether we can navigate by their light, whether we understand the cycles they trace. They shine regardless, patient and eternal, available to those who choose to observe. The recovery is possible where knowledge has been lost. It can sometimes be recovered through archaeology that unearths buried texts, through decipherment that gives voice to silent scripts, through observation that rediscovers what was once known. The Maya glyphs were unreadable for centuries. Now they speak. The Antikythera mechanism was corroded mystery. Now its workings are understood. The stone circle alignments were dismissed as coincidence. Now their astronomical precision is recognized. What seems lost may be recoverable. What seems silent may speak again to those patient enough to listen. The knowledge waits in silence, in undeciphered scripts that may yet yield their secrets, in astronomical alignments not yet recognized for what they are, in texts that survive untranslated, in traditions that persist unrecorded, in observations that were made but whose significance was not recognized. The silence is not empty. It holds what we have not yet recovered, what we have not yet understood, what waits for the insight or the accident or the determination that will bring it to light. We close as sleep approaches, as the stars wheel overhead, whether we see them or not, as the ancient knowledge persists in fragments and transmissions, and the patient waiting of what has not yet been recovered. The journey through time is complete for tonight. The ancient voices have spoken what they can speak. The silences remain where the voices have been lost. The lesson is offered, not answers, but questions, not certainty, but responsibility, not conclusion, but continuation. The knowledge that waits in silence, the preservation that requires our choice, the stars that shine regardless of whether we watch, the connection to all who have watched before us, all who will watch after us, the continuity of human attention to the heavens that began before history and continues still. Sleep now. The stars will keep their watch. The knowledge will wait for those who seek it. And when you wake, remember that you too are part of this long story, inheritor of what was preserved, guardian of what must be transmitted, participant in the ancient human effort to understand the sky that shelters us, that guides us, that connects us to cosmos vaster than we can comprehend, but which our ancestors began to map and which we continue to explore. The maps drawn in light, the memory, though faded, the stars that remain, the knowledge that waits. Sleep. The journey continues tomorrow.